Good morning, everybody. All right, it seems pretty loud. Is that me? This is my first time. This is amazingly cool and slightly overwhelming to be part of Stir Trek and to be here speaking to you today. So thank you so much. And I'm excited to talk to you about database DevOps and really how to manage your database as code at various levels. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of ways to do that, and really want to get into it. So again, my name is Ryan Booz. This is just unique for me. I'm hearing a feedback, so my brain has to adjust here for a second. These are the important ways to get a hold of me. And so, you know, I do a lot on Twitter still. Fairly active blog, getting more active. I do mostly Postgres. My journey, which you'll see in a slide or two, has been through many databases, but my current focus is on Postgres. And so a lot of what I do is Postgres focused and in that community specifically. And doing more and more even on YouTube, some specific, you know, how to do some of the stuff I'm going to show you today with various databases and tooling. This presentation, a version of it is already up there. Anything that is, every time I speak within a day or two, I'll get the newest version up. Just in case something goes wrong, I usually give it a day to make sure I can go adjust the slide. But again, the previous version is already there, and other presentations I have done will be there as well. Really quickly, a little bit about me, just because sometimes it's nice to know something else about someone. I live in State College, so drove out here last night with my son, who's with me. My wife and I have 6 children, so we're a very active family, have a lot going on. So if you want to talk to me about something other than databases, DevOps, or Postgres, certainly family is one way to do it. I love music, actually have a degree in music. I'm an amateur beekeeper, and I actually stream when I go out to the hives as well. So if you have any interest in bees, I can probably talk with you for about 3 or 4 days about that, because I love bees. And I roast my own coffee. So I like to get jacked up on caffeine, and I'm happy to talk to you about all the nuances of having fun at home roasting coffee. So I was going to try and adjust this deck and put some good references to Guardians of the Galaxy in, and honestly, sometimes my creativity in those areas goes down. So I just wanted to at least get one thing in here and say that we are Team Rocket and Groot in my household. So there's my Guardian of the Galaxy slide. There might be one other appearance in here later. Here's my quick journey, just to give you an idea of where I've come from. So I've been at this thing for close to 25 years, graduated about that many years ago from college. Most of that time I've been doing something in software development, and databases has always been a love and a focus for me. And so I started early in my career playing actually with Postgres. I was at a private school teaching, and we were trying to do a project, and I was looking for a database, and I was on the internet, and someone recommended Postgres. And so I did Postgres, MySQL, ended up at Penn State for a few years. Go Lions! Sorry. There's one. I know there's one. Come on. All right. I won't call you out. Anyway, so I went to Penn State, and I was looking I'd been used to MySQL or Postgres, and no one there had heard about either. And so the only thing they could provide me access to do a project was DB2. That was one of the worst experiences of my life. And then I eventually left Penn State, and I spent 15 years as a SQL Server developer. So I was in an ISV company doing energy software, and really came to know and love both .NET and SQL Server and the Microsoft Data Platform. And what happened was this really odd and interesting experience right here in 2018. I'd been at the company 15 years, and I was really interested in big data. And so I wanted to move on to some bigger data opportunities. A local company in State College was doing real-time predictive analytics. And I said, I'm going to go help you. And so we had great conversation. And I signed the contract, left the company that I loved, many dear friends, showed up the first day. They gave me the connection string, and I said, this isn't SQL Server. They said, oh, yeah. Well, you signed the contract a month ago, and in that time, we have been working on moving over to Postgres. I said, oh, OK, well, that's new. I didn't expect that. And so I have been reinvesting and learning Postgres now for the last 5.5 years. And honestly, it's been a joy. And the last part of that journey, I then began to do advocacy. That is a hard word to say, at Timescale, which is a Postgres time series database. And most recently, I've moved to Redgate Software. So as a .NET developer, SQL Server, you may know Redgate for a lot of the tooling that we provide around databases and DevOps, monitoring, and so forth. And we are getting into cross-database development, and that is why I've joined Redgate. So what we're going to do today in the next 55 minutes, 50 minutes with some time for questions is talk about the problem we're trying to solve. And I continue to be a little bit shocked, even in myself, how there are many solved problems in development, and there are many ways at solving a problem. But there are still many times where this specific problem of how to manage databases code is still not really solved in many organizations. And obviously, the bigger the organization gets, the more complex that is. And so we want to see what some of the options might be. We'll talk about the different architectures, where you might be, some of the ways you might be doing it, or you have done it in the past, and hopefully some ways that you could increase your productivity with some new look at architectures. If everything goes well, I'll give you a quick example demo. Now, because I wasn't guaranteed Wi-Fi, I have not booted up a VMware VM in forever, but I had to do that to make this happen. So hopefully it all works out. We'll get a little demo, and then we'll just review a couple goals. All right, so here is my experience and why specifically databases code and managing this has really been a passion for me for a long time. As I said, I spent 15 years in a small ISV. The really quick story of that company is they were bought by Enron in 1996. If you are over the age of 45 or 40, you probably know Enron. If you don't, just forget about it, okay? But it used to be, I knew that I was crossing a threshold. I used to do interviews for new developers, and that was always part of the intro story. And then we were bought by Enron, and then we bought the software back when they went bankrupt, blah, blah. Eventually, you mentioned Enron, and there's just a blank face, and you're like, oh, you weren't born yet, okay. And so the Enron had done a lot, gotten us, they had a process there, but there was a 90s process, right? And a lot of bash scripts or command line scripts that would weave files together, and you would have some kind of process that would do a model, and then one person, because the software is so expensive, he was the only guy that could do the stuff. So we were kind of stuck in this, and so what would happen is we'd have a new feature. Now we're in 2010. We're doing web APIs. We're doing all .NET stuff. We're doing REST APIs and so forth. And the front end is making progress, but the back end, we're still kind of stuck. And so this is what would happen. We'd have a really great idea, and we would have our meeting to decide how to break that out into tickets. We'd have a planning meeting. Those tickets would usually end up at that time we were using Jira. And we would think like, great, we've begun the process, right? We're doing DevOps, we're doing Agile, and we've begun that process. Inevitably, what would happen is the CEO, who was not part of his smallish company, so he was kind of the stakeholder, and he would always have the ideas. And so he would start to hear about what we're doing, and his mode of communication was email. And so those suggestions would usually end up in an email. We would then start chatting about it because someone would forget to make these notes on the Jira tickets. And while this is all happening, we have that one guy, because we only had that one piece of software for Irwin to keep the master model of the database. And we're relying, and by the way, Larry was also our only remote worker. Okay, so again, we're like mid-2000s, 2010. So he was the only remote worker. He got left in Houston with Enron. Everyone else came home. And so we're hoping he's picking all this up. And so he's doing these changes to the master database, his model, and he's kind of keeping this thing going. And then we would be ready to deploy, and things would end up, we'd have these dev databases that we would check to see, did the model work? Are the things that we're talking about in process? Are they where we expect them? Does it match with our .NET model? Is this all happening? And eventually, of course, one of them wouldn't work, and so we would start the chat all over again. Hey, Larry, do you remember this one default setting we needed? What about that column? Did you change the width? Oh, forgot about that. No problem. Update the scripts. You generate the scripts. We do the thing. Eventually, we would get everything in all clear, right? All of our backups, dev databases, instances would work out. We'd finally get the diff. So now we would get to the point like, okay, this is it. He had his master. Now we have to get the master diff. This is our master migration to get to the next version. This process was not a one-day event. This is a multi-week, multi-sprint event going on. And inevitably, there's still something caught in here. And we would upgrade one of 1,500 client databases, and of course, 10 of them would fail for some reason because someone made a change behind the scenes, and it wasn't in the model, right? We've all been there and experienced that. We finally get this diff. We would schedule downtime, right? And we had the luxury in that circumstance because we were not a 24/7 operation. Most of our clients were US-based. They worked during the day. We had processes we could run at night, so we would get up at 11 p.m. and we'd start our upgrade process that would take 4 or 5 hours. And if everything worked out, we finally got databases upgraded, and we were really happy. Has anyone experienced something even remotely similar to that? Oh, thank you, I feel seen. That's great. But there had to be a better way. I can't tell you how many times I would call Larry, and Larry had been there a long time, by the way. His real name's not Larry, protect the innocent. And he'd been there through the Enron transition. So, right, he was with the old company, bought by Enron. Everyone moved to Houston because the money was so good. Like I said, Larry's the only guy that didn't come back because everyone else was like, well, there's nothing here. We're going to go home. And I would say, like, there's got to be something we can do here, right? Why are we relying on you? You're awesome, but why, like, you're that one point of failure. There's got to be a better way. And so we started to explore, not long before I left, opportunities for improving that workflow through something like DevOps. I just love this image. That's why you said I'm a big fan of Blues Brothers. I was about to say the Blue Street Boys. That was weird. Anyway, so what is DevOps? Now, I know DevOps is like some of these images I've used over the last few years, and part of this is mostly for comical relief, because it is still funny to me that right now today, if you go to Google and type DevOps, you will get more than this smattering of images. So there's still not full clarity in what we all mean when we say DevOps. So there's usually this something overlaps and we're all working together in some way. That's good. There's usually some kind of circular momentum-y things are working together thing. Okay, I kind of get that. Then there's this. I don't even know what this all means. I mean, I guess pick any of the thousands of things on here and you'll magically be DevOps. And then this is my favorite. Like, what does this mechanical robot have to, I don't even know, but supposedly this is DevOps too. So what do we mean by DevOps? Oh, this is my best. Pause for a comedic moment. Okay, and that's so true, right? So what do I mean by DevOps? And I think this is, hopefully, we are now many years into this transition and this buzzword, but what we mean is specifically in the data space, and really everywhere, right? We want to deliver value to end users. That is the whole point of Agile and DevOps and having a process that makes this whole thing flow as easily as possible. But not just that, it has to be something that everyone can work towards together, right? It can't be one group that just has a really great process, but still has to rely on, a Jira ticket that might get picked up in 3 days by some other group. Right, there's got to be some workflow that has protection, automation, the ability of continual feedback. Now, what we're going to talk about today in the data space is really just these top two pieces. Again, there's only an hour. I don't have enough time to talk about it, do a demo, what have you. But we'll hit on a number of these places. But if you get this top piece done well, then the other pieces, number one, you can focus on them more easily, and that circle feedback will help you, get that feedback so that you can feed back into the process. I just said feedback way too many times. So we're going to talk about standardizing and how you can do it in a team-based environment, a team-based approach, and what that looks like to automate at the database level. So how is DevOps going in the world? Now, at Redgate, we have done a survey every year for the last, 6 or 7 years, I think, just asking about DevOps generally. Now, again, most of our clientele, most of the people that use Redgate tools currently are .NET, Microsoft data platform folks, and tens of thousands of people that we connect with, and so the survey has been pretty interesting. And as we'd expect, when you talk about DevOps and process, it's been going up over the years. And so at this point, 70+% of people say, yeah, we do DevOps, or we have some kind of DevOps process, which is awesome. However, when we talk about database changes, we see that the story is really a lot different. So when we ask a simple question, continuous delivery of your changes, where are you in that process? Most of them say, 75% or less are saying we have some or no process for doing database changes effectively or efficiently, right? You might be able to apply a change. I'm not saying that you don't have some portion of this, but having the whole feedback where you can do this in a way that is predictable, you can see the process happen, and then you can get the feedback to go right back into the next loop at the database level, that just becomes really challenging. And so we're trying to help with that. And why? Because a lot of us are still working on older, complex systems, number one, right? When I talk about my process with Larry, that was a system that began with Enron in 1997, and it worked, right? Like, why fix it if it ain't broken kind of thing, except it was, and you'll see in a second why. And you can probably figure it out anyway. And then I think the number two reason on here, if I think you can read it up there, is lack of resource, right? Most teams, the database is a thing that's so essential, and yet one of the things that is least resourced in most companies and most teams. And so how can we bring those two things together in some way? And so what we are beginning to preach more and more at Redgate and trying to help folks see is this idea of shifting left, right? So we get stuck in a process, and we believe that, again, it's not broken, so why fix it? But if you could take one thing, a couple of things we talked about today, and even just select one of them, and bring that earlier into your development process, the benefits long term, you'll begin to see that feedback happen. Maybe it's something small. Maybe it's the ability to do some kind of code check that you didn't even know was possible on your SQL before it gets deployed, right? Why wait until you go to deploy and then realize someone named something incorrectly or accidentally dropped a table or didn't put concurrently on an index? Like, why wait to that moment? Why not do something you can bring that up further in your development process? Maybe it's taking a clone of production-like data, not the data that everyone knows is not like production, and we know something's going to not work once we actually get to production. What if you could bring more production-like code earlier in the process at the staging level? What if you could bring production-like code to the developer level? So now developers are working on databases that look like production, have data just like production, have the anomalies just like production, and they could do it in 30 seconds. And they could throw that copy away. There's all kinds of ways you can shift left within this process to make the database change a lot more effective. The one thing I didn't talk about, and so when we talk about shift left is this, I didn't talk, so here's my other Guardians of the Galaxy reference. The one thing we didn't talk about, I mentioned it briefly, is even when we got to this point, the transition was smooth for 98%, 99% of our databases. There's always a few that didn't work. And it's always because somebody was trying to be helpful and fix a problem, right? What's the line in the Guardian of the Galaxy's one? Like, well, what if I want to change the database more than the DBA wants me to change the database, right? I think he says, what if I want to steal? What if I want it more than the owner wants it? Anyway. And so someone's trying to be helpful, but they've now caused more work at 3 a.m. when we need to fix this thing. So what if you could also detect some of that ahead of time by knowing that you're working in an environment that really is more and more like production? And so what we're trying to do is this. We're taking that whole workflow. Now we can have our magical idea. We can start to do the magic. We can actually start to create the tickets, do the code. And now we get to this point where as we're coding, we're working on databases that look similar to production. Not just test data that's like some random thing with 1,000 lines that in a table that normally has 10 billion. Right? We're taking even maybe subset. One of these might be slightly smaller, right? It still looks like production, but we take a subset of that data. So if we could move that up closer to the top of the development cycle, we shift that process left, we're going to solve a whole other class of problems here that we would have waited to way down that pipeline I showed you previously. And then when we build and test this, now we take that code and we, as part of the deployment process, even with our application, we actually are doing that, again, on more production-like data. We're doing it in environments that are going to show the warts, even if they weren't caught ahead of time. We're going to do some other tests that we couldn't do maybe on a developer workstation in some way. Maybe we do some more integration tests that just don't make sense at a developer level now that you have a more realistic data set. And if we can do all that in the cycle, we can just keep repeating that until we have a lot more confidence that when we hit that deploy button, we know what's going out has both a much higher chance of being successful. We understand the exact order and process in which things are going to happen. There's been visibility across the entire team, not one person, with one tool, with one set of bash scripts that were written in 1996. all right? That is the ultimate goal here. And then obviously as part of any DevOps process, we want to have a way to monitor it. And so if, that is another conversation for another talk, but if you have this top process done, you have a lot more confidence in what you're about to do. Now you can monitor for what maybe was missed, what might need to be improved, and you can feed that quickly back into the cycle, and you get a lot faster process because you know that you're working on things in a process that's going to mimic more of your production database. So let's talk briefly then about what some of these architectures might look like. And you probably are going to associate with one of these, and it'd be interesting to see where you're at. We generally talk about this in three formats. So one is we still have manual change management. It is okay, you're in a safe space. How many people still do manual changes on their databases? I feel you, I understand that, there's nothing wrong with that. We'll get you there. There's state-based management, and then there's migration-based management. All right, and so we're gonna talk about all three of those, and there might be a mix of some of each of those that might give you a little bit more power in how you approach these changes. I was really happy with the migration symbol I chose. Anyone get that? I just thought that was really cool. Okay. Birds, ducks, they might, okay. So manual state change management. Why do we do it? Anyone want to venture guess why we do this? It's really, really easy. I mean, I used the word, I thought it was 3 times on this page, right? It's just really easy. We know how to connect a database. We know how to write pretty simple SQL. When there's a fire going on, it's really easy just to quick do an alter statement and hope that you don't lock the database table too long, right? Like, okay, great, we'll come back and fix it later. We know that it is error prone though, particularly if you host more than one database, right? If you are a multi-tenant solution, in my case, we hosted upwards of more than 1,000 databases, right? So every client at the time, and a lot of that was contractual. It wasn't, we also had a multi-tenant version with hundreds of clients within a database, but contractually we had many, many clients that required their own database. And so if we make that one change, we don't remember to apply it later, we've just set ourselves back, right? We're gonna end up in that cycle the next time we have that release. And it's not scalable, right? We're really back to the 1 or 2 people, number one, who have the permission to do it, and often the 1 or 2 people that really know what's going on, and then everyone else later, I can't tell you how many times something be going on, and a developer in the back of the room be like, is there a chance that we dropped an index the last time, and that's what's going on? Like, he was almost sheepish to ask, and like, oh, actually, yes, we did drop an index, and no one caught that. Oops. Right, so now more people are seeing this, or less people often see those changes if you aren't aware. It is Wild West, and it's probably not what you want to do, all right? I was gonna try and work in a Guardians of the Galaxy there, but that was such a bad movie. So what does this look like? I mean, we are still doing it today. We've all admitted that. I still do it now. There's still times I'm doing demos. I'm working with my team, even just to do demos of things. And I realize I end up with a different version of my laptop than someone else, right? Some people, if this was your filing system, you probably know exactly where that change is, but no one else is ever going to find it, right? Some people, at least I have things labeled. We have a method. We name things by month and, application and table or something, and maybe the team has a better chance of finding it if we put it in there. Maybe you're really pedantic, and that's great, and this is what your file system looks like, and you're keeping track of all these changes, and you have some way of doing it. That's all well and good. Hopefully this isn't it. However, how many people have received a change set over email because something was on fire? I absolutely have, right? So this still works. And if you're lucky, maybe at least there's a note in a Jira ticket somewhere, and I keep saying Jira, but whatever you happen to use, GitHub Actions, the joke of Jira, whatever it might be. Here is the big problem though. At the end of the day, I kept telling Larry, I love you. You're very talented, you're super smart, you have given us so much value over your 20 plus years of development, but what happens if you get hit? What happens if you join the circus and you're no longer here? We're up a creek, right? And so we need to figure out how to change this process. So what we got to, we were kind of caught in this middle state. We almost had a state-based management, right? So Larry was doing some kind of state-based model. He's the only one that could see it, though, and he's the only one that knew the nuances around how to get any value out of that state. And so if you can at least bring state forward to everyone else, you start to bring awareness, you have an opportunity to at least do two things. Number one, you have more visibility, right? So if you can find a tool and a way to model that so that everyone else can see it and experience it, touch it and feel it, make sure they see the changes, you just bring visibility and awareness. There's some education opportunity there. And number two, you now have something that is not a database, a physical database, that is your golden master. That's the other problem we often run into. Well, we always make changes on this database. That's the one that we take a backup of. That's our master schema. That's where you can find the stored procedure in the flavor it should be in the last. Really? Are you sure? Because I'm pretty sure 60% of us just raised our hand and said we run code by hand somewhere, right? And so that's one of the problems that we can end up with. So state-based at least allows us, in theory, if we can keep that rolling, we have that one thing we can always go back to. And we can start to do things like identify one source of truth. We can, in most cases, for many of us, ultimately, we might be doing very small micro changes. And if that's your development workflow, we add a column, deploy it. We add an index, deploy it. That might be really useful. That might be really great in your situation. Oftentimes, that's great for the development flow, but we still want to then get to a place where we have that one change that we've tested. We know that all of the things together across our platform will work. And state-based gives us that opportunity. And then, like I said, the other thing it's really good for, if your tool supports it, is detecting things like drift. So that when all of us were putting out the fire and we changed a database and we go to deploy it, we get told, you can't deploy right now because the thing you're about to deploy to doesn't match the model that you said this thing should be in. Something has changed. Even though it says it's at migration 10, it's not at migration 10. And so that's the other thing that's state-based can really give for you. There's a lot of ways to approach state-based. And again, you are probably in your teams doing something like this in a relational nature. So we have older tools like something like Irwin or ER Studio, so an entity relationship application. These go back to the 80s and 90s. I'm not lying to you that half of these, and I'm sorry if someone is in here for some reason that would work for one of these companies, I can't imagine. Some of these have not, the code base has not been updated in 15 years. All right, they're still selling this at $800 a pop per seat and what have you. Right, so it's not that it's a useless tool. It might work for you. Just recognize that, you know, again, as other things happen, they are slower to keep up. And often because they're expensive, you're still down to one or two people. And that, you know, that closes in the circle of who can be a resource here. Database first tools, if you're a .NET and a SQL Server developer, as I was, I love SSDT. There's a lot about it that's good. And it did provide, it started to spread the nature and the observation of a state-based model across the team because we all had access to Visual Studio. The problem is we still couldn't rely on the one-click push deploy across 1,500 databases. There's just too much nuance that we had to know and understand and test. And so we were still in this, we have a state, but we still have to manage our process, and the two things were disconnected. And is there a way to make those things come together? Then there's manual. Like I said, there's plenty of people that have that golden database. We take a backup every night. We know we can always get back to it. That's our template database for our application. If you have something like this, many of these applications could work for you. Right? So again, I'm in the Postgres space. We have a number of tools that do schema management. They actually inspect the database, provide some kind of textual model of the database so that you can diff it and see what the changes are and what have you. Most GUI tools provide some way to compare two databases and get a diff, right? So there's a way forward in many of those applications. The problem is, if you're doing that manually, you have some golden master that you are updating or a team is updating and maybe the rest of the team doesn't quite get it. You're simply getting a diff out, and most of the time people are just trusting that diff. They haven't seen the process happen over time. And then you still need all these things. It becomes well, we did the work. Now we're going to spin up the databases. And it was this, right? This is what that still usually leads back to. We had a database, we get this diff, and it's so much later in the process. We weren't doing all of that testing earlier on, and because we had one master, and we only have one tool to get that diff. And so what I think a lot of us have moved to at some level, or are moving to, is obviously migrations. And there's some value here, for sure, right? We can oftentimes, if it's ORM or code-based, right? I'm in a room with probably, I'm making assumptions here. How many people are .NET-y in nature in what you do? Okay, that's what I assume, so at least 50% of you. It might be something like Fluent Migrator. It might be Entity Framework, which is getting better release after release, right? And that the hope and the goal there always was, originally, at least in my estimation, we could write one source of code and get many databases out the back end. Rarely do we see that in practice. I don't see many companies that are developing a database application and they just magically have it available for 3 different databases because who knows, maybe the client wants to use Oracle today and SQL Server tomorrow. It's probably not what's happening. And so, oftentimes we give up some limiting features of that modeling because for a hope that might never really be realized, and some ability to manage what happens on the backside. There's a lot that's great about it. For us, again, when a couple clients, until I started in advocacy, I was always a .NET developer. And I tended to we would do our models in code, but we wouldn't actually generate our schema out of those models. So we would generate our models separately, similar to what I'm going to show you in a few minutes. And then we just had a process that would update our models with every cycle. So every time we did a deployment, the models would get updated so that we could keep going with the part that was CRUD-based and then the other stuff that was, we had specific code for. One of the biggest problems that we have had, and it still continues to be a problem, it is getting better every release with every source of code, is things like triggers, functions, stored procedures. Every database, those things change quickly. Now in the Postgres space, it's a particular problem because we have updates every single year, right? We have a very predictable release cycle of Postgres. There are new features every year, and it's really hard for tools to keep up with all of the changes that are happening and the features that might be coming. Even something as simple as how indexes are created or not created. Sometimes those features can be hard to keep up with. That's just one of the challenges. It doesn't mean it's impossible. You can often do static code in your ORM migration, but then you've lost, again, a little bit more of the reason for doing it, right? Now you have SQL code in the middle of a migration, in the middle of 30 other migrations, and it's hard to know when that thing changed and where it changed and why, right? And it's hard to get back to a state. So, obviously, my desire, what I always have preferred, is a tool that I can work in SQL. And I think a lot of people, once they see the opportunity, if you have those resources, and you have something that is, particularly if you can integrate these two things in a state-based and migration-based way, you have that model you can always go to. It's always very clear exactly what it should be right now or what it should have been in a previous version. You can do those, you can get the code out in a way that is readable in SQL that we all know. So migrations that are SQL, very similar based, right? Now we just have step-based management. It's usually pure SQL. Now most tools, whether it's Flyway, Liquid-based, or a couple others, will allow you to do some kind of code-based tags and markers inside, so you could have things like when I say language support, I thought I had a different word on here, which I'm looking for, and I'm not seeing it. So you could, you can basically template, so you can actually do some kind of templating inside of your migrations and to do variables and so forth. So it's a nice cross of both that gets you a little bit more flexibility. The nice thing about these tools is, again, they often allow you to do things like baselining, so you can start from where you are. You don't have to start from scratch. A lot of ORM tools don't have an efficient way. More and more do, but have not had the most efficient way to do repeatable, idempotent kinds of things, right? Static data, scripts that need to run on every upgrade. It just gets a little bit more challenging, and particularly getting that feedback. There's a couple different options. There's many more than this. I know these are ones that have come up when I've talked to particularly .NET developers. DBUp has been popular. over the last number of years. It continues to have active development. It's not one I've personally used, but I know people that honestly do appreciate it, and it is MIT licensed, so it's open source. Skitch is one I've used. Now, I put this in here again. My current world is mostly Postgres. It is the one tool that actually currently does not have SQL Server support. But it does have support for many other databases. It's an open source tool that's been around for a long time. And here's the thing that I actually really like about Skitch is it's very simple, right? It is Perl-based, which is surprising, but it still works. It's very easy in a Docker container. And the nice thing about it is the gentleman who wrote this came from a very code-based background, thinking about how would I do database migrations as code if it were my other code. And so every time you begin a migration, you always get a verify folder. And the assumption is that when you do deployments, you will write SQL, kind of like a tap test or something, that would say, hey, did that migration work? And if not, we can roll it back, we can fail it. And so that was just built into the framework. So it's very Git-like in the commands that he wrote. And it's a neat little tool. It just doesn't have SQL Server support, but it's one that a lot of people talk about. And then finally, you have tools like Flyway, right? So obviously, it works for Redgate. And what I'd say is this. I chose Flyway a couple years ago before I've used Redgate tools for many years as a SQL Server developer. And when I had moved to that company that was doing Postgres, we actually started to do a Redshift project. And I needed a migration framework. I had young developers. They had no idea what it was to maintain a database and do migrations. I said, we're going to start this project correctly from scratch the best we can. And I looked at a couple tools. We ended up using Flyway because it just made sense in our workflow. I didn't actually know when I came to Redgate that I had just learned they had bought Flyway. I didn't know that. I was going to help with some other things. And then what you'll see in a minute is they've actually incorporated the best of both worlds for me, which a couple other tools do something similar. And I think it's a process that can be really helpful in what you're going to do. So I'll show you that in a second. So again, Flyway, a couple other tools like this. Most of them have some kind of open source free tier that help you manage migrations, have a number of feature sets that will help you do that process a little bit more smoothly, get it into your workflow pipeline, whether it's in DevOps or Actions or wherever you might be. Depending on the tool, you have a lot easier way to deal with something like repeatable migrations, undo scripts, things like placeholder, depending on the language. So Flyway can do things in Java. I think Liquidbase does things in XML and Java, maybe. I forget, quite honestly. Active support usually with these tools, and so they're going forward. And like I said, what I had always wanted, when I was in SQL Server world, I was using SSDT, I really wanted both. I wanted this model-based tool that allowed me and my team to easily see exactly what was happening, verify at the SQL level, it says this table changed. I can literally open up the table and see what column was added. That's really powerful to me. It's not some random script of alter table with one column. Right? I can see the whole state of that table, see when it changed. But getting that migration then and managing the migration process was challenging. And I always wanted something that could do both. And I mean this sincerely, I didn't know that that's what Redgate was doing. I had been using SQL Compare for many years. They had ReadyRoll, which is kind of migration. They had never weaved these two things together. And so again, Flyway and some other tools, maybe like Liquidbase and others, are starting to try and bring these two things together because there's a lot of power in it. Helps you move that up in the process. So what it means is you can do your normal code, you can take that model, you can, from the database and the code, you can extract your model so you always know where you're at. There's automated processes for things like drift detection, I said earlier, things like code analysis. And then you can easily integrate this because of the command line tools with your current workflow, right? So whatever your deployment process is now, you can start to integrate your existing database, quote unquote, take a snapshot, as it were, of it, baseline it, and begin from this point forward, all right? Now, what I have time to show you is a really small piece of this process. This is not in total. Like I said, I didn't want to rely on the internet. The one thing I can't show you here today easily, just because it's my laptop and the image I'm using is our normal image that we host in the cloud, and it's like half of my hard drive right now because I had to get it down. I can't show you the cloning piece, but there's a lot of people we're working with now. Again, what we are hoping to help people do, and there are many technologies for this, SQL Server, Postgres, and elsewhere, is bringing those clones, those images of production-like data, higher up in the workflow, right? So as a developer, what I want to be doing is I wish I could show you today, hey, give me a snapshot, give me my own database that is like production, and let me code against it. When I'm done, I can just throw it away. And that's called thin cloning. And so you basically have usually masked, right? We take some kind of snapshot or subset of production, and we bring it up into our cloning environment. We mask it so that sensitive data is not an issue. And then the developer can simply say, hey, give me my own copy. And in 10 or 15 seconds, they have their own copy. It looks like, feels like, acts like production. And then they can just do their work, throw it away, and that process becomes much simpler. And then we can do that same thing in staging. So cloning is one thing I can't show you today. Everything is local, but otherwise the process would be pretty similar. So let me just explain sort of quickly. I tend to do this. I actually thought I would do this in SQL Server, and I realized I didn't have the database I wanted on here. So I'm going to do this in Postgres. Are there any Postgres users in the audience? Thank you. I feel like I'm not alone. This is great. So let me just tell you really briefly. This is a demo database that's pretty common in the Postgres space. I'm slowly working on updating it a little bit, and hopefully I'll get my copy of it out here fairly soon. It's a DVD store. Sorry, we're a little bit antiquated here, but they put a lot of work into a number of the features, and they keep this database up to date as new features are rolled out with Postgres. So we decide we're going to add a new feature. We're going to track the social network of all the actors in our database. Well, we had talked about it. One of the developers did what we normally expect someone to do. He went in behind the scenes. They went in and they added some columns to the actor table, which is not what we wanted to see happen. So we had some work had already been done. We need to fix that work up. So we're going to drop those columns. There might be some data in those columns. And so we want to drop them. We want to add the new tables. Now, none of this is fully perfect. This is a demo for demo's sake. I might add other foreign keys. I might have other columns. This is our workflow process. We sat down. We had planning. This is our minimum viable product for the next go. We're going to add some indexes. And along the way, we realized that with this new feature, the database, the BI team needs to be able to do some new reporting. Now in Postgres, we can't do cross-tab queries without an extension called TableFunc. So if you don't know Postgres, I have other talks. I'd love to talk to you about it, and I think one of them is even online, just about Postgres for the SQL Server developer. One of the great things about Postgres is it's an extendable database. You can install hundreds of different extensions to do something as simple as create a new data type, a new index type, or become an entirely time series database just by adding an extension. And so when you need to add functionality that's not part of core, you or someone else could have written this extension, and so TableFunc gives me queries, functions to be able to do cross-tab development. It's really important because, again, a tool that can pick this up and manage this is really valuable because in this case, extensions are per database, and they are versioned. So if a new version comes out, number one, you need to make sure it gets installed in every database, and you need to make sure the correct version is installed in every database, right? So if you don't track that, if I simply say TableFunc, that's actually TableFunc version something. If I go run, install, create extension TableFunc in some other database, and it doesn't have the version I'm using, now we have problems. And so knowing how to manage that is good. And last, we're going to create a function. And there's an interesting thing that we've decided as a team. I don't know why this exists. It's probably Larry in Enron days told us that we cannot have function names longer than 25 characters. I'm not going to count this for you, but this is longer than 25 characters. And so, again, manually, if we're trying to catch all of these things, it becomes a really difficult process, right, to make sure that we're doing that all the way through. And so we're going to create a rule set that will catch those. So I'm using a tool called dbeaver. It's just an open source database tool. It's the closest I have generally gotten to something like SSMS for Postgres. That's why I tend to use it. It shows well in demos rather than command line. So the way I do this stuff is I simply say Control-Enter. And I'm just going to quickly run through this. You can see these things are happening. I'm creating these tables. Oops. This is not my updated script. That's what happens when you reset a VM, right? We create some indexes. Oops, down arrow, not up arrow. We're going to install that extension. Now you notice that this is very small, but even you can't tell when you run that what version was installed without then querying the database. So again, this is really important in Postgres. It might not mean as much to you if you aren't using Postgres. And we're going to go ahead and create that function, all right? So this is step one. One of the developers did this. They had a local copy. Hopefully it would have been a local clone, so they could have made sure this all worked. Again, that's the one point I can't show you today. As that's happening, I'm actually now have a project in Flyway. And what Flyway has is what's called a schema model. Oh, which I think I have open over here. I didn't think I did. There we go. So Flyway has a schema model, which it is keeping up as we do this. And so you'll see in the Pagila schema, we have our aggregates, we have our domains, we have things like tables. And it's just keeping an update of all those tables. Now, this is Flyway's choice. It turns out that most tools over the years have chosen not to store all of the, I don't know if you know this about databases. The SQL standard, there's a thing called the information schema. And every relational database has to have the information schema, which tracks most of this. That's how we can do comparison across many databases. And then every database has their own set of catalog tables that have other information. It turns out it's pretty hard to track changes in pure SQL across many different database types. And so the team at Redgate has chosen to do their own, they call it the RGM format. It looks very JSON-like, but it allows them to parse these things very easily to get that schema model in comparison when we're doing things like generating migrations, doing drift detection, all of that stuff. But it's a text file. So when I add a column, you'll see in the diff that the column is added in this model. And so we know exactly at this moment what the state of this table is supposed to be. So we're tracking that. I made changes to that dev database, and now I can ask Flyway to detect those changes. Now, this is often more powerful in something like SSMS when you're working with developers that is not what I expected. My apologies. Let's see what happened here. I'm in the right database. Maybe I did not. This is very interesting. Applied. Ooh, sorry. It's like, I did not expect to see drop. Within the tool, you can apply the change that just came in, right? So because, again, we have a schema model, even if you don't generate migrations, you can actually work locally. So this is more powerful if you use a GUI tool, right? If I would update those tables in SSMS, I didn't write any SQL, you see this. Now, for me, when you're working, you might not have noticed I am working in a branch called dev. We could have many branches going on. Because we have that textual schema model, I could pull in changes from other developers. I could then see from those changes, just because I'm doing the script doesn't mean that it's in the correct order. It doesn't mean I have all the steps. I'm simply trying to get the feature going, and eventually we need to get the full final migration done in the correct order and the way that we need to. So I have those changes. You can see that it did everything we expect, including, as I said, this is important for Postgres. When I go down to the create extension, again, a tool that can detect the version is really a good and powerful thing when you're working in a database like Postgres. So we have this. We're going to save that to the schema model. And when we eventually commit this, you'll see that what the diff ends up being, right? So if I will commit this at the end, we'll see that in just a minute. And then what we can do is actually say, hey, we think we're done. Like, again, maybe this process has happened over time. We've pulled in changes through whatever our workflow is, Git or what have you. And we're going to generate some migrations to get us to that next point, right? We didn't have to try and piece everyone's scripts together. We have the model. All the developers can see this. We can go through. Now, this is much slower on my laptop because I'm running this VM. And so it is essentially verifying that nothing else has changed under the covers. I wish I could change the resolution, but I can't. It just is what it is here. And it picked up what we needed, right? So it got rid of those columns. It added the table func, did some other things. Some of those then are not, you'll notice that they look very much model-based. Now, there's this argument that says, well, that what you would have seen there is, create table, and it's this, it's the state of that table, because that's what the model is showing. Now we need to take the diff. So we essentially say, hey, we have our current database. We're going to apply it, something we call a shadow database. We basically wipe the shadow database out every time. We apply the entire model. Then we take what you have in your current branch model and generate the migrations out of this. Now, the power of something like that is, this is where you begin to have the ability then. This is where SSDT was always a little bit frustrating. If you just hit deploy, it went, right? You could just save the script and do a lot of this, but then you now have two tools going. Here, we get you to the point of saying, hey, here's your migration. And now if something like, remember that one of my developers had already added those columns, or what if there was data in those columns? We probably, no tool is going to detect that by default easily, right? So probably what we would need to do in here, I'm not going to take the time to do it, but we'd say something like, select whatever it was, Twitter, ID, from, and we would make sure it gets inserted into the new tables that were just created. Maybe we do a little test in here as well. All right, we have those things done. We'll say stir, trek. We'll save those migrations. So now we have what we need. When we go to commit those changes, you'll see a couple things. And I had an undo script. I don't have time to talk about undo, but undo simply says, oh, that's right. This is where actually the team, I'm trying to get them to make a collapse here when we have small screens. I'll try and show you in the other tool. We have all the files here, including the model that has shown the changes, so we can see that over there. Changes made for MVP. Going to commit those. And now we push them up to our repo, and if we have confidence in our process, we can start to do things like see this thing kick off like we would any other database project, right? So now it's going to start to go through some automated workflow. Again, this VM is slightly slow, so I have to wait about 20 seconds before it kicks off here. I will let it kick off automatically. If we look at the repo, I'll come back here in just a second. If we look at the repo, I will show you briefly what I mean by that state model change. Let me go to Pagila. And now if we look at the model, so for instance, we had, I believe is the actor table, right? And now we can see between versions, if I do the history, oh, there it's building. Oops, that's not the one I wanted. We can see what the changes were. So we know at every commit what was changing in the models or in the various feature sets that we were doing and what our golden model is. So now that we saw that the thing is building, and one of the things, remember, we wanted to do was have some assurance that the code passes muster. And so I had some code rules, one of which checks. It's a regex rule that says, are all function names at least less than 25 characters? Because that's what Larry told us they needed to be. And so it's doing that. We can also do drift detection at this stage. We could do it at another stage. Typically what we would do then, which I'll probably kick off as we take questions. So I ran that code report, and this one is just the code report. There's other things you can do in a tool like Flyway or others. And that drift report will actually show you things like, hey, you had somewhere down here, and I'm missing it. Somewhere in here should be the characters longer than 25, and I'm probably missing it. Sorry. There is the drop, which is not not allowed. That was another rule that said, hey, there shouldn't be a drop statement in here. And then we could trigger something. We could fail the build. We could send, some kind of notification so that the process stops here. And that begins that workflow. It brings it higher, a step left in the whole process. And then, again, if everything is good and correct, we have the opportunity then to move forward. And we could even do something like, oops, that's what I meant to do. We can go ahead and do our pull request. I'll let this go while I take questions if there are any. But this then will take it to the next level. And so this is very much open to how you do it. This is whatever workflow you're choosing. I'm just going to go ahead and auto-complete it. Sorry, let me approve it. There we go. And so what that should do is kick off then a pipeline that is doing something to prod. So in this example pipeline, we next go to staging. What we would do or hope to do is do this against a staging version of the database that's a clone. And now we could do other tests. We can actually do that drift report. We're about to go to prod. Are the databases in prod, do they match the model I expect? If not, the process stops here. It doesn't go another step forward where we lose time, all right? That is building out. We'll let that go. I'll maybe show you in the last minute that it did apply. But we have 5 minutes or so for questions or thoughts. The only thing I would say, I do forget that I have one last little slide is this. The ultimate goal is at least trying to do something here, right? Get this process in more flow. Why is it important? The last time I gave this talk was great because I don't know if anyone was affected by this FAA issue, and it was a database deployment problem. That was pretty antiquated, and tens of thousands, millions of people were affected by it. That's why this process matters. So you want to standardize early in what we're doing. Anything you can do is shift left. Take one idea and do it earlier in your process against your database. Find a tool that will help you do one of those things. And hopefully you can drive automation. So, any questions? Yes? Tell you what, I can, let's see if there's other questions, and if not, I'll do that, or we can talk afterwards, for sure. Just to show you a little bit more, this is a little bit longer reports. Now, this is the staging, and we can do things like code analysis. You can actually see the script that's going to run, see if there's any drift, and what have you. All right. Any other questions? Yes? Yeah, great question. I hate to say it depends, but it depends. Oh, yes, thank you. The question is, yes, we are out here. Do the migrations typically live in the same repository as the code? I see probably greater than 50% that do, because it's an easier way to keep your pipelines together, right? You can have multiple steps in your pipeline and use these tooling. It really depends on how separated your databases are, but if you can, I personally prefer that for my developers' sake. Yeah. So the question is, when it comes to something like Flyway, at least, are all the smarts for doing the comparison in the app itself? And the answer is yes. There's nothing that is, there's both the desktop app, which is what I've always been missing with Flyway. When I used Flyway 5 years ago in the open source version, it was a bear to get running because of the different flavors of Java and what have you. But everything is now in the desktop app, and then there is still the command line tool, which you add into your pipelines to do that work for you, actually do all the processes in your pipelines. But it's all self-contained. Yep. Question up at the top. I mean, that's a really great, the question is how difficult is it to run it across multiple database types? Flyway itself supports 32 different database types. The migration stuff I showed you in doing the diffs currently supported in SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, and Oracle is coming and has some support right now, depending where you're at. And can you do it across both? Absolutely, within a pipeline. In a situation like that, we often have multiple Flyway projects in the repo for the code folder, and each repo then has some, each folder has some variables attached to it that will tell it what to do when you're doing the pipeline. Yes, sorry. I love to roam. My apologies. It's also really hard to see with the lights here. Any other questions? If you have any questions online, I'm assuming not? Okay. Really, come find me today. Reach out in my, I'll just go back here to say, again, this is where you can find the presentation. GitHub, Ryan Booz, presentations. Please feel free to reach out to me, though. And on Twitter, LinkedIn, what have you. Particularly if you have Postgres issues, I'm actually in the process, this is not an advertisement, I promise you. I give a talk often about moving to Postgres from SQL Server. And if you find yourself in that situation soon, come talk to me. Have a training session I've done previously on some of that as well. I just love helping people do that faster because it's been a long struggle for me. But I really love Postgres too. So please feel free to reach out and talk to me about it. I'd love to. Thank you for your time today. I hope this was helpful and something that gives you some vision for what you can do next. Thank you.